Hi class, this is your instructor, Skylar Huff. I am here now in the 27th chapter, which of course is on the seedless plants, and we're learning about mosses. So as we were last here, one of the most important things to know is that these plants have flagellate sperm. That means that their sperm require water for fertilization. When we do have a test, ensure that you know that you will have to go through the alternation of generations for all plants, because all plants do alternate among a haploid gametophyte and a diploid sporophyte generation. You will draw and add in each process is leading to each part. Mosses, as they are the bryophytes. They are from phylum Bryophyta, and with approximately 9,900 species living in dense colonies. In those dense colonies, what they do have is a rhizoid. So along with the rhizoid, they have that stem-like structure that bears those leaf-like blades. But keeping in mind, all they have, of course, are those specialized cells. They have no tissues. So do keep in mind that they lack any vascular tissues, which is why they are short, living in those dense colonies. They have no roots, no stems, or leaves. And on that same note, keep in mind that that green gametophyte is the dominant generation, which of course is what you all see here. On the left-hand side is the green gametophyte generation. On the right-hand side is that diploid sporophyte made up of the capsule, which produces those haploid spores via meiosis, is attached by way of the seta, anchored in by that foot, and of course there are a few gametophytes shown at that bottom left-hand side, looking closely at that bottom left-hand side. So what we have here is the green gametophyte shown there on the left. On the right-hand side is that diploid capsule, that sporophyte generation that it of course composes. It is not always there because, as mentioned earlier, that sporophyte is dependent upon that gametophyte. So the capsule does produce those haploid spores by way of meiosis. It is attached by way of the seta. There is the foot that anchors it down. And then even at the bottom you can see part of more of those gametophyte generations. That haploid generation that's always there, and of course in being dominant. So fertilization does happen with water, whether it's flowing water or even splashing raindrops. As that occurs, that allows those sperm cells to be released from the Antheridia, as you all learned prior to now. And of course, those Antheridia will swim toward that archegonium, and by there is fertilization, leading of course to that fertilized egg, and of course the diploid zygote, which of course goes back around, completing of course that life cycle. So with that, excuse me, as it does germinate, it grows into a filament of cells called the protonema, the moss protonema, which we all will see in lab, which of course there will be no face-to-face lab this week. As I do continue on, from here I'll move on to the next group after I finish up with this alternation generations for the mosses and getting into, of course, the liverworts, the next group. So the liverworts are more formally known to be from phylum Hepatophyta, with approximately 6,000 species. Yet again, the dominant generation here is that gametophyte generation. And what is different here, of course, is they are thalloid. They have this thallus, meaning they have this liver-like structure. And of course, it's lobed, as the liver is. So with that, one common liverwort seen is Marcantia, which we will see when we do have a lab. But yet again, there are no leaves, there are no stems or roots. So with that being the case, they do still have that leaf-like blade, but yet again, they are just specialized cells because they have no, of course, true tissues. Along with that, they have the hair-like rhizoids, which, of course, anchor the plant into the soil. That reminds me, of course, what you may indeed see when you look at a root, but of course, it's not a root at all. So with that, they still indeed have the Antheridia, as well as the archegonia, more colloquially known as the archegoniaphores, which bear the archegonia, and the Antheridiaphores, which bear, of course, the Antheridia. And with that, if you look down at the bottom left, let's get into reproduction. So at the bottom left, here in the liverworts, they reproduce by way of these things called gemma. So those are two gemma cups. So what happens with those gemmas, or the gemma cups, is within those are the gemma themselves. So the gemma are those tiny balls, and you can see this in your textbook. So asexually, the splashing water, the splashing raindrops, allows fertilization, well, would allow the sperm to swim. But the same way is asexually those tiny balls are dispersed, and as they are dispersed, those tiny balls then allow them to reproduce and, of course, create yet another liverwort thallus. So, to make sure I reiterate what I've said, inside those tiny balls called gemma cups, splashing water will hit the gemma, the tiny balls, to allow asexual reproduction. But yet and still, these anthoridiophores, which produce the antheridia for the eggs, still need water for sexual reproduction. These are classed the liverworts. Next up, upon showing the arconiophores, are hornworts. So the hornworts are from phylum Anthocerophyta. Typically, the hornworts are found in very disturbed environments. Yet and still, water is required for fertilization, and it's typical to find these in, I guess I'll call the areas that are exposed to a lot of, I guess I'll say, disturbance, such as roadsides even. But the very same way, I haven't seen these in life before, and that's all you all should know about what are called the hornworts. Up next is a photo of what a hornwort looks like, with, of course, that sporophyte generation still, of course, being the taller generation, and the generation that's not always there. Up next, of course, we get to, of course, two types of leaves. I mentioned two types of leaves because those two types of leaves are known as A. microphyll and B. megaphyll. So, to help you with that and make it easy, when you refer to a microphyll, it just means it has one vein, that one vascular vein, as opposed to a megaphyll, whereas megaphylls have many veins. And those megaphylls, I would say but I say they are the leaves that you typically associate with a typical leaf today. So we'll now get into, of course, the next portion of the chapter, which gets us into the seedless vascular plants. So typical of which is the seedless vascular plants to be known as the ferns and their allies. So we'll begin these with, as you see it here on the far left, the club mosses from the Lycopites and Lycopodiophyta. So let us begin. Lycopodiophyta. The club mosses, they are not mosses themselves, but you typically see these in the woods. They look like, I would say, small pine trees, or at least small conifers. So Lycopodiophyta, as it is, excuse me, includes about 1,200 species. Lycopodium is the one that's well known today. And as it states, they have, of course, a rhizome, meaning true roots, and, of course, stems, and even leaves. Here they have scale-like leaves. Their leaves are known as microphylls, as shown to you on the photo. Microphylls. So I cannot stress enough. These are very short plants, meaning they are less than an approximate 10 inches. They have true roots, true stems, and leaves. And in this case, those leaves are known as microphylls. What's different now is they have what are called the strobilus. This is a new term for us. So the strobilus is what, of course, bears spores, the sporangia. And with this, we'll move on from, of course, the club mosses to our next group, the ferns. So the ferns include an approximate 11,000 species. They're from phylum Pteridophyta. Phylum Pteridophyta. So in this phylum, the ferns as they are, what makes them, I would say, unique is that they are terrestrial, although some are aquatic. So the ferns inhabit many areas here on Earth, from, of course, the tropics all the way to the Arctic Circle. As ferns are, they're typically, of course, found in moist areas. Hence, I planted ferns near my air conditioner outside the window. With that, some ferns do still indeed grow, of course, from the cliffs, on mountains, or even in deserts. So the life cycle of fern, it's quite interesting. Meaning it's so interesting that you will find at Canvas that I have the fern life cycle, and I'll include the fern life cycle in your test. You all will write in each portion of that fern life cycle, as you all see on the paper that's, or at least on the file that's at Canvas. I'll show you a life cycle here too. But what I'm getting at is just as you all were shown to begin the chapter being 27, All plants alternate among that haploid gametophyte and that diploid sporophyte generation. So as they are, ferns, they have what is called a frond, being shown to you all now. I think is 4 fronds, or at least 3 fronds. So here is a frond there. There is a frond here. And of course, there is a frond there. So the leaves of a fern are known as fronds. So the rhizome is a horizontal underground stem. The rhizome, of course, you cannot see it here, but it is a horizontal underground stem. On the right-hand side, those fronds begin as fiddleheads. Yes, I said F-I-D-D-L-E, fiddleheads. So they begin as those fiddleheads, and of course they carefully uncurl, and of course develop into that frond itself. So what makes these pretty interesting also are where you find spores. So finding spores on the fern are pretty interesting because many species bear their spores at the underside of the leaves as you look closely at the top right. So yes, those are the spores, or at least where the spores are found. I'll get more specific. So more specifically, on the underside of the frond are known as sori. That's S-O-R-I. So individually, you could call it a sorus. So a sorus has spores inside, and those are dispersed. Yet and still, water is required. So yes, those spores are dispersed, and water is there. And as water is there, they can then, of course, develop into, yet again, a new plant. So with that, I'll continue moving through the prothallus. So the prothallus is what begins, meaning that's that gametophyte generation. So the difference here is in comparison to the bryophytes, mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. All 3 of those have a dominant gametophyte generation. Well, now that we've got into the seedless vascular plants with the club mosses and now into the ferns, and of course the rest of their allies, the sporophyte generation is now the dominant generation. I say again, the sporophyte is the dominant generation. In other words, what you're seeing here is the sporophyte generation. At the bottom right, this prothallus you see would be that gametophyte generation. It is going to be very small and what I call microscopic. So that's, I would say, one of the biggest differences. One of the biggest differences. So to get back to what I was mentioning about water, yes, as those spores are dispersed, keeping in mind that water is still going to be required for fertilization with these flagellate sperm. Hence, of course, you're going to find these things in very damp or at least moist areas typically. And then, of course, keep in mind to go through the life cycle of the fern because this is going to be on your test and you will write all about it. So it's there for you. Fill it out and practice it. Up next, I'll get to the life cycle. So this is generally what you all will label and just use that document. It's a PDF. Print it out. Practice it. It's on your test. And if you have questions, always ask. So the bottom, of course, what you all can see is the frond itself, meaning that frond with, of course, fiddlehead here, fiddlehead there, and, of course, this horizontal underground stem known as the rhizome, and then to the absolute left-hand side, those roots. So we're here in the sporophyte generation, that diploid and dominant generation. So as you continue on to the left, you'll see, of course, the frond and the sori. So with that, of course, as those spores are dispersed, with water, of course, fertilization can occur. I'll leave it at that. Next up, of course, are whisk ferns. The whisk ferns are in the same phylum as the ferns, with about 12 species. I've seen one of these before. It was, in of all places, it was inside a bank. But this is Psilotum nudum, the whisk fern, and it has dichotomous branching. I'll leave it at that. It's nothing more else to say about the whisk ferns, but I'll go nextly to, of course, the horsetails. The horsetails are in the same phylum. It's approximately 15 species of horsetail still in existence, yet and still. They used to be the dominant plant, meaning approximately 300 million years ago, the horsetails were what roamed the earth. Not that they moved, but of course what dominated the earth in growth. So with this, because of the horsetails and because of how many horsetails that there were, they contributed to the vital and vast coal deposits. And of course, along with that, would have been those ancient club mosses. With that, is from the genus Ecosidium the horsetail is. and they grow in mostly wet places or marshy habitats, but typically they're less than about 4 feet tall. So what makes them so distinct is, of course, their shoots. Their shoots are hollow with those photosynthetic leaves, and yet and still there is a strobilus that is at that apex, yes, the strobilus, that of course bears those sporangia, those spores. So with that, the horsetails, now grouped with ferns, they have true roots, true stems, and of course leaves. I mentioned already those hollow stems. And in days prior to now, those horsetails, they were used, of course, as a way to clean pots and pans. They were known as that scouring rush. So they had, of course, more than just a role to provide us with those things for, I guess I'll say, fuel. And along the same note, I would say to please keep in mind that the horsetail life cycle, of course, is quite similar to that of the ferns, which I will not review now. And I guess it's all about the seedless vascular plants. So what I'll get to now deals with spores. And what I'll do now is very important as we make the transition from the 27th chapter with those seedless plants to the 28th chapter to those seed plants. So keep in mind that the spore, as it is that way in which you go from being not just that thing called a sperm or that thing called an egg, but of course that very next generation. So with these life cycles, more often than not, it's only been one type of spore, meaning it's been homosporous. And I guess I'll put it as being that there are some ferns and club mosses that are heterosporous. And when I say homosporous, I just mean that they have one type of spore as a result of that meiotic process. When I refer to those being heterosporous, I'm referring to them having two distinct types of spores. I'm referring to those being microspores and megaspores. If you have your textbook, it'd be great to follow along with me. So what I'm getting to is that sporophyte, of course, produces the sporangia and the cone-like strobilus. And each strobilus bears two kinds of sporangia. They are the microsporangia and the megasporangia. So in the plants, I'll say, typical of which is micro, would be that male portion. So of course the microsporangia, of course, are sporangia that produce those microsporocytes, or those microspore mother cells, as I would write this in class. So those, of course, microsporocytes will undergo meiosis to perform those haploid microspores. And then, of course, each of those microspores develop into that male gametophyte that produces, of course, sperm cells within the antheridia. I hope you all can follow this. On that same note, megasporangia produce megasporocytes, or also known as the megaspore mother cell. When the megasporocyte undergoes meiosis, they form those haploid megaspores, and each of those develop into a female gametophyte that produces eggs in the archegonia. So having stated this, this is a more important part, because as I've given you this, what happens thereafter, of course, is going to be what is called fertilization. So this is, I say, the key to the evolution of plants. Meaning, unlike the gametophyte of that seedless vascular plant, is the male and female gametophytes are not truly free living, is what I'm getting at. Fertilization is what follows by the development of that new sporophyte. So the biggest part of what I'm saying is heterospory evolved, and it is significant. I mean, the most significant development, I would say. And of course, plant evolution, because it led to the evolution of seeds. So it is what characterizes, it being heterospory, characterizes the two most successful groups of plants in existence today, known as the gymnosperms, and of course flowering plants, both of which produce seeds. I hope this has helped. From here on out, we'll be getting ourselves into what are called the seed plants, chapter 28. Thank you all for listening. Brief review, of course, of what we've just done. If you have any questions, as always, please do not hesitate to email me or call me. Thank you all, and have a great evening and a great day.